I'm very happy to introduce Hugo Hogenbrink, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Groningen, where he is working on digital corpus analysis and text mining on early modern natural philosophy texts. His conventional research focuses on the analysis of the work of Conway. He also has other interests in the philosophy of fiction, the philosophy of time, and concept formation. And I'll hand over to Hugo.
Thank you very much. Am I doing it correctly when I do it like this? Is now the slides visible?
Yes, yeah. It's full screen for me. Yeah, thanks.
So I want to sort of begin with thanking for this great opportunity to show this paper on this conference. At the same time, I also want to apologize. It's going to be a pretty winding argument. So I'm going to be going through a lot of different stuff in Conway, and that means I'll also be skipping over some of the discussions where I know that people will disagree on some of the assumptions I'll be using. It's either going to those or it's going to proceeding with the entire argument, which I do think ties together some interesting stuff in Conway, or potentially ties together interesting stuff in Conway. Okay, so the talk is called Processual Plenitude in Conway's Principles, and the core of the idea is first, I'll argue to you that Conway makes use of plenitude, and then after that, I'll argue that there's sort of, we'll look for what is being maximized when she is applying plenitude, and there I'll argue that there's sort of two routes we can take for interpreting what it is that God is maximizing when he's creating creation. And those two options, so one of them will be pretty familiar. It's just you have a creature in a moment, and you just want as many of those as you possibly can. And the alternative that I'll be going for, which I'll call processual plenitude, is that you're not maximizing these momentary creatures, but you're maximizing creatures as life histories or as beings, in any case, that can't have complete existence within any singular temporal moment, but who need to be conceptualized as being extended over time. And maximizing those, and maximizing also the diversity between those, because you don't get two of exactly the same. So then the plenitude will be a plenitude in which you get a maximum amount of different types of creatures living eternally in different ways. So, and I'll have two types of arguments to favor the life history view. The first is that I think, given at least some reading of Conway's views on time, a static creature in a singular moment, given completely, will imply things that she explicitly denies as possible. And more positively, I want to tie it together with like this broad set of topics in Conway where creatures have freedom, creatures have supreme mutability and transmutation. And I want to show how those can be conceptualized as the only way to maximize the diversity of life histories, which in turn will explain the goodness of creation, which has been proposed to also be understood in a different way, which I'll respond to in the end. Okay. So plenitude. Principles of plenitude will tell us something about, usually in the early modern period, it will tell us something about, well, God is not envious, or God is infinite. So if he creates maximally, whatever that exactly turns out to mean. But usually proceeding from an analysis of God's nature, we can find out that there is some kind of non-arbitrariness to the way that he fills in his creation. And this non-arbitrariness can at least be somewhat constricted. by demanding maximality. Probably that thing which he maximizes is also analyzed to be of value to God in his creation. So, for example, we might find somebody to argue that we want an as good as possible creation. So then we have a maximization of the goodness, or we might want to have a maximal number of creatures, or there might be some other object that's of particular interest. So let's go through, I think, two main places where Conway tells us that she is invoking plenitudinousness. So in the first is in chapter 2, where she says, "For God is infinitely good, loving, and bountiful. Indeed, he is goodness and charity himself, the infinite fountain and ocean of goodness, charity, and bounty. In what way is it possible for that fountain not to overflow perpetually and to send forth living waters? For will not that ocean overflow in its perpetual emanation and continual flux for the production of creatures?" So here we have a statement of Conway. Well, and this maps very nicely onto this sort of broad tendency to say, well, God is not envious, God is charity. So, I mean, when he starts giving, he won't stop. And we get in this specific quote also this sort of sense that there is an overflowing or an emanation. So you get this more Neoplatonic flavor of emanation, of plenitude. I want to sort of put a stop on that way of reading it for now. For in the chapter afterwards, she'll give it in a more sort of in less poetic and less Neoplatonic terms. For the reason there for the plenitude is different, where she writes, "And so he, God, created worlds and created as quickly as he could, for it is in the nature of a necessary agent to do as much as he can. When these divine," and then a little bit later on, "when these divine attributes have been duly considered, it also follows that an infinity of worlds of creatures was made by God, for since God is infinitely powerful, there can be no number of creatures to which he could not always have added more. And as has now been proven," which is referring back to, "for it is the nature of a necessary agent, he does as much as he can." And she'll repeat this: "Since it has already been demonstrated that God is a necessary agent and that he does everything that he can do, it follows that he has multiplied and always multiplies and increases the essences of creatures to infinity." So I won't go into exactly what Conway thinks it is about the nature of God that leads him to plenitude, but we see here two different models arise. We have a model that comes from he's perpetually overflowing. There's, in a way, charity and goodness, and there is a connection between being a necessary agent and being constricted from not actualizing possibilities. So we get there a modal explanation of it. All that can be done is done. In both cases, so the question that I pose then is, over what does the plenitude range for Conway? And this is a question of the scope of the plenitude. So as I mentioned a bit earlier, the scope might have been the goodness of creation, or the scope might have been this or that. But what is it in the case of Conway? And I think the best way to pin that down is just to see how Conway applies it. So here are two cases where plenitude is invoked to clarify what the object is. So in chapter 2, she'll say, from the plenitude, it is argued that time has to be infinite in both directions, since a beginning or end of creation could imply that there are times where there could have been more creatures, but they are in fact not there, is something she'll argue in chapter 2. And in chapter 3, we'll find that there can be no empty or idle conceits of the mind or imaginary spaces. And the reason for that is because this would imply a place where God would not be working as hard as he could have done, and he always works as hard as he can, where God's work consists in the creation of creatures. So that's why there can be no empty spaces. So what this tells us is, so the conclusions are about, can there be empty space? Can there be a finite amount of time? And the impossibility runs via plenitude, because the scope of the plenitude is the number of creatures. So what is maximized in creation is the number of creatures, because it's the number of creatures that are here the ad absurdum for empty space and for a finite amount of time. They are not in accordance with God's nature, because there could have been more creatures. Okay, so then Conway's scope of plenitude, I propose, is the creatures in creation. I don't think this is a very crazy thought. But then the question for me arose, well, what are the creatures in creation from God's perspective? Because God needs to somehow conceptualize these creatures and then decide to create them in one way or another. And it's over this that his plenitude will range. So there's two kinds of, I think there's two salient cases that we can formulate. Either the creatures are static, in the sense that we might have a complete creature, we might have Paul in one particular time, in one moment, and Paul is maximized over time because he is reiterated over different times. So God's goodness will make sure that he won't be annihilated. So every moment in time we'll find Paul again, and we'll just have Paul infinitely. So we have the maximum amount of creatures. We get a maximum amount of creatures in a singular moment, and exactly that many creatures will be there in the other moments. The alternative is that creatures should be understood as as extended over time, or as I would say, as their life histories, processes of change, in which case creatures are never wholly existent in any specific moment, but should always be conceptualized or understood with inclusion of previous states. Or, in fact, it's their whole becoming that's the relevant way of conceptualizing them, and their states are only sort of epiphenomenal on this continuous motion. The second, I call them processual plenitude, and there's some initial evidence to seriously consider this option. So in the first case, you would have to admit of static entities, whereas we get these repeated claims that the nature of every creature is to be in motion or to have motion, right, by which it progresses and grows. But I guess to really hammer home that that we need to make a choice here and not just be guided by what seems more intuitive, namely there's creatures in singular moments. Notice that the two cases are very hard to distinguish from each other initially. So normally, if you want to object to the creature being understood as a big life history, you might insist, well, first, there are times where the creature is there and there are times when the creature isn't there, right? If you have those kinds of situations, you're pretty safe in saying, well, the life history of the creature is still there, but the creature isn't. So clearly what's relevant here is that the creature is in the relevant moment. But this sort of counterfactual situation can't obtain for Conway because, as she'll say, God was always a creator and will always be a creator because otherwise he would change. Therefore, creatures always were and always will be. Moreover, the eternity of creatures is nothing other than an infinity of times in which they were and always will be without end. And then she'll repeat this later in terms of annihilation or the lack thereof. Nevertheless, they, creatures, individual creatures, will not be annihilated, as is easy to conclude, for how can anything be annihilated, since the goodness of God towards his creatures always remains. So what I want to point out is that once you apply a fullness of creatures, once you apply a fullness of creatures in a singular moment, you also imply a fullness of creatures as eternal becomings. And once you imply a fullness of creatures of eternal becomings, you have also implied a fullness of creatures in all the moments, because there is no situation in which anything ever disappears again of the creatures. So this is an ambiguity, I think, in what Conway would mean by creatures, and in that sense, in which about what the plenitude would range. Okay, so that's where we are now. As I said, it's a bit of a winding argument. This is what I wanted to assert first. There is an ambiguity in how God conceptualizes creatures, because from his perspective, there isn't that big of a difference between creating a fullness of creatures in singular moments and a fullness of creatures as extended over time, because they are either reiterated eternally or they are there as an eternal chain. Okay. Now I need to argue for this second case. That's sort of the meat of it now. So I think there's a reason why these static entities just can't be there. Or in this sense, that creatures can't be completely understood as being within a singular moment or in a singular time wholly. And I think this follows from what she'll tell us about time. So we'll have here the quote: "Time is nothing but the successive motion or operation of creatures. And if this motion or operation should cease, then time itself would cease. And the creatures themselves would end with time, since the nature of every creature is to be in motion or to have motion, by which means it progresses and grows to its ultimate perfection." So this is already being pushed in the literature to make a point that Conway can be conceived of as a relationist and not an absolutist about time. But I want to tease out something else that's in this quote, and it's about the very first part. So I want to insist on time is nothing but the successive motion or operation of creatures. So this is stronger than just asserting that it's the creature's temporal properties which eventually will sort of generate the more abstract temporal properties. It's asserting that it's their motions or operations specifically that do that, not their places, not their temporal places. So there seems to be a primacy here, she's asserting, of motion over time and times. And I'm taking that to mean that the relative temporal positions of different creatures need somehow to be extracted from their relative motion. So this is not just that their absolute positions need to be extracted from their relative positions. It's their relative positions need also to be extracted from their motions relative to each other. Now, that's tough to make sense of. However, Conway is pretty unambiguous here, I think, in claiming that. So any temporal properties, like temporal position of creatures, need to be understood through their motions. There cannot be a case where we first have their places, their temporal place, and also from that their motions. Now, if we take that very stringently, there seems to be a problem with having a creature existing completely within a singular moment and then being reiterated over those moments. That's for two reasons. The first is, it seems like we have temporal position, again, not just being primary, but just being independent of motion. So we could make sense of the different times in which Paul is, over which he is reiterated. And we can do this without any reference to his motion, which would contradict time is nothing but the successive motion or operation of the creatures. And it even, so maybe it's independence, that would be bad. Even worse would be that probably you can now make sense of the motion of Paul in terms of his successive temporal positions, which cannot be the intention. But if we have Paul wholly existing in singular moments and reiterated over moments, you're not maybe not necessitated, but it becomes very natural to make sense of Paul's motion as changes over those different moments. And again, that would be an inversion of this claim that we found. The alternative view is that the creatures are temporally extended, of course. So we have the temporal extension and we have the relative temporal extensions, and from that we find the moments in which they also are. In which case the creatures are being conceptualized not as static entities wholly present in moments, but as temporally extended beings or becomings. Well, yeah, as that, more or less. So this is an argument from exclusion, right? So this is just saying I don't think the static entity model works. This is the other salient option I can conceive of. So I'll go for that. And that's then where we are now. So I've argued that if you have complete whole creatures in moments, you just have a problem with deriving temporal position and moments from their motions. You have inverted what Conway asserts. If so, this would also be in favor of processual plenitude, because the moment that we conceptualize the creatures is not as the static entities, but as the processes of becoming, then this is also God's position in what he's maximizing when he's doing that. Okay. Now I hope, of course, I don't know exactly when we began, but it was probably something like 10 past. So let's keep going.
Yeah, it was about 10 past.
Yeah, okay. So the last part of the presentation is showing that there's also some other elements in Conway's system that I think can be tied together with this. So in particular, I think this is one way to account for or to oppose what Peter Lobston is saying when he says that no theodicy is offered, no attempt at solving or treating the problem of evil. Conway rather assumes that all suffering is in fact merited. Lobston's intuition derives, for example, from cases like this, which makes sense to me. There seems to be a lot of arbitrariness in how, at this moment in time, in any case, creation is, or when Conway wrote, or there seems to be a lot of arbitrariness in how it's constructed. It seems like, for example, if we accept that spirit, that there is this hierarchy of being where we have the more spiritual and the more coarse. If I remember it correctly, then Lobston says, well, it seems perfectly possible for God to have created the world in such a way that we would all have been just a bit more spiritual at this exact moment. And there's no real reason that can be given for the fact that we are as we are right now. So in that sense, no theodicy is offered, because the lack of goodness that we are encountering right now in creation cannot be accounted for. But at the same time, so this is one option. You just accept that no theodicy is offered. That's in the end what Lobston does, I think. But that does disagree with what Conway is saying, especially in the case of the arbitrariness, because we find in these quotes, therefore, true justice or goodness has no latitude or indifference in itself, but is like a straight line drawn from one point to another, where it is impossible to have two or more equally straight lines between 2 points, because only one line can be straight and all others must be more or less curved to the extent that they depart from that straight line. God is, so that he must do whatever he does to and for his creatures, since his infinite wisdom, goodness, and justice are law to him which cannot be superseded. So we get a case where here God is necessitated, but he's also necessitated to create creation in the one particular specific way, right? There's no latitude, there's only one straight line between the 2 points. So if we take Conway seriously on this point, there has to be some way to account for whatever arbitrariness we do encounter. And in fact, Conway will also insist that whatever God is doing is also good. So his infinity will shine forth in the works of his hands, indeed in every creature he has made. So there can also not be a disavowal of the goodness of creation, like God was making something non-arbitrarily, but he didn't care about the goodness. No, this should shine forth from every creature he has made. So yeah, the creation, there should be a theodicy. But and yesterday there was, so this is one of the reasons why I prefaced. So yesterday we had a discussion of understanding creaturely freedom in line with God's freedom. I'm not doing that here at all. I'm basing myself just on the idea that the creatures are, in some strong sense, free to do the one or the other, and that this is a different freedom from God's. So I base myself then on, it is possible to utterly refute and eliminate that indifference of will which the scholastics and those falsely called philosophers believe to be in God. Okay, for this indifference of will is the basis for all mutability and corruptibility in creatures, so that there would be no evil in creatures if they were not mutable. And this indifference of will seems to be somewhat at odds with the claim that God is creating creation in one particular way, namely the one particular way in which he is necessitated to do it. At the same time, God is creating creation in such a way that they have indifference of will and the capability of following their own inclination or their own willkür. But this is odd, because this sounds like Conway is telling us, well, yeah, okay, God created creation in one particular way, but then he let creation sort of run amok according to its own devices, that's a strange sort of necessitation. Except, so say that we're puzzled by this. One solution to the puzzle would at that point be to say that God indeed does create a creation that is capricious, and it is up for the creatures themselves to take their different paths through their eternal lives. But that this is an explication of the plenitude of God's creation. So at the point that God has decided that he is creating creation as fully as possible, and that he conceptualizes creatures as eternal becomings, then he is forced to also allow all kinds of becomings that are capricious and evil. So if we have the voluntary freedom for the creatures, we can see this as sort of a necessary precondition for attaining the plenitude that God is aiming for. So this would be one way to sort of solve the tension between the free creatures and the necessitated God, is to say that God did have only one choice in creation, namely create one that is so radically free to self-determine so as to allow for a maximal diversity of life histories. And the creatures will do the rest. They'll assert themselves in all kinds of different ways. I think I'll skip this. So in other words, what I've been trying to do, and this is also something that Sarah Hutton has insisted on, is that we need to find a way to make sense of the creaturely mutability as somehow exhibiting goodness for God, and also, and in effect, also their freedom. or their indifference of will. My proposal is to say, well, it leaves them free to assert a maximum diversity of life histories. Hutton gives a different suggestion, and I want to sort of end by opposing that, where she says mutability is an instrument for both manifesting the divine goodness communicated to the world and for increasing goodness. And I mean, there's more than enough in Conway to base this on, right? So there's, for the highest excellence of a creature is to be infinite only in potentiality, not in actuality. That is, it is always able to become more perfect and more excellent to infinity, although it never reaches this infinity. So then the idea would be, well, why are the creatures mutable? Why are the creatures free to some extent? Well, they need to be infinitely perfectible. That's sort of the thing that God was aiming for when creating creation, making something that can perfect itself. So I think there's a problem with this view, and it's essentially that it seems that the infinite perfectibility is exhibited fully by the Christ, by the middle substance, where she writes, therefore there are three kinds of being. First, altogether immutable, and well, the third we know is that which is nevertheless able to change from good to good as well as from good to evil. But the second is something that can only change towards the good, so that that which by its very nature is good can become better. Now, and I've had a short discussion with Jonathan about this before. I don't have a specific reason. I don't see why God couldn't just have created a creation of very many Christs, many different ways in which they are self-improving. He didn't, and that means there must be something also about the corruptibility of the creatures that interests him. So it can't just be the infinite perfectibility that does all the work. Then I don't know why he made this most furthest jump to that which is most alien to him. And then I'll stop. The alternative, of course, is to say that, well, the alternative is my proposal. There's processual plenitude, there's infinite diversity of ways of becoming, and that's what God wanted, and that's also why Christ is very uninteresting for him and can be only a mediator and is of no further interest, whereas creation is of great interest because it can exhibit this plenitude. And then the quote that I want to insist on is the one where she'll say, it is the nature of every creature to be still in motion and always to change from good to good, or from good into evil, or from evil again into good. It's the nature of every creature to be like this, and I think it's also it undermines the possibility of understanding creatures as infinite perfectibility first, and then also sometimes corruptible. They're essentially corruptible, and we need to account for that somehow. And that's it, I think. Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, it's a roller coaster of an argument. Yeah.
No,